All right, welcome. So, good morning. Welcome. I thought I found a really good hiding spot for my talk. Apparently, you guys are dedicated. So, my name is Gregorio. I'm a software engineer. I work on the infrastructure side and the client side, actually, for the API infrastructure that Google uses to deliver APIs. And we're here at Introduction to Google APIs. As Tim mentioned in his keynote, this is the speaker meter for this particular track. So if you want to scan that. So the talk's going to be, just like it says, Introduction to APIs. We're going to go very slow. We're going to go over a lot of the pieces that we have in place for APIs. This is not the only talk going on about Google APIs. An adjunct to this talk is the lab this afternoon, hands-on with the Google APIs, where we'll be basically going over this same exact talk, but much slower and with a lot of hands-on in between, hands-on working with the tools and with some programming. The write-up is listed as Python. If you don't know Python, do not be afraid to come. It's a very simple language. We're not doing a lot of complex Python programming in that track. So just thought I'd pitch that session for later. So it's BootCamp. Let's dive right into the code. Okay, this is Python code. I don't expect you to understand it. And by the end of this talk, I don't really expect you to understand it either. But hopefully you'll have a better idea of what's going on in the code by the end of this talk. And more importantly, you will know where to go to learn the pieces that you don't know. This is a teach a person to fish rather than giving them a fish type of talk. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll know where to go. Before we start talking about, get into some of the meat, I want to give you a little history, how we got here. So Google has a lot of APIs, right? I think close to 100 APIs. And we've been at this for a while building APIs. Last year at I/O, we introduced some new API infrastructure that we've been building. And that allowed us to build APIs easier and also to build client libraries easier. The reason we did that is because at Google scale, we have what's called an M by N problem, right? We have close to 100 APIs. We also have at least 5 languages that we want to support on a regular basis. So every time we add either another language or another API, that's a lot of updates. That M by N, 100 APIs by 5 languages, that's 500 points you got to fill in. That doesn't really scale very well. And so we came up with this new API infrastructure that, again, we introduced at I/O last year that helps us. It gives us some common information on the back end and some common information on the client side that makes it easier to build libraries or to add a new API to an existing library. So part of that is discovery. And that discovery document is a machine-readable representation of what an API looks like. All right? This is useful because it's useful for clients. If you're writing a client library, you can consume that format and build a client using just the data there, or it's useful for building tools. I'm going to show you a few tools that are built on top of Discovery. We use it ourselves. If you want, I'm not actually going to go into the format or anything like that. If you're interested in it, we have a section, Building Custom Client Libraries for Google APIs at Google I/O proper. And we'll be going into very great detail. So like I said, though, we support libraries in different languages. Actually, I'll get into that later. Okay. But we have lots of APIs. These are the APIs that we have today that are built on top of that new API infrastructure. Now you're at Google I/O. Who knows, during I/O, this list may actually get longer, but we won't go into that now. But we have these APIs. So we've got Buzz, right? If you use Buzz, there's an API for Buzz. So if you want to programmatically add things to your activity stream, add comments, things like that, that's what that's for. Latitude API, that's our location API, or your phone. Search API for shopping, just like it says. It allows you to programmatically look through the product search. Google URL Shortener. This is actually the one we're going to focus on for this talk to kind of get our feet wet looking at all the various APIs. It's a good API because it's small, it's easy to understand, but it covers, you know, some of the bases that we want to talk about. So it's good in that respect. Google Custom Search lets you set up a search engine just for your narrow slice of the internet that you want to search. Moderator API is an API for the moderator that we introduced, I think it was last year. Moderator allows you to, you know, people to ask questions. Prediction API, probably one of my favorite APIs, allows you to take large gobs of data and apply machine learning to them. And so you can apply machine learning to that data and then go back and use the prediction API a second time to say, okay, I've got this one sample, what do you predict is, you know, going to be? What's going to happen with that data? So that's really cool. And diacritize allows you to pass in some foreign languages, non-English languages, and get diacritical marks for them on how to pronounce them. So, and like I said, possibly many more coming soon. So let's look at Google URL Shortener. If you haven't seen this before, this is a product from Google, goo.gl. So let's go there and look at goo.gl. And it's a shortener service. You type in your long URL, and it gives you a shortened version of that, http://www.google.com/io. That's actually not a terribly long URL, but I can shorten that, and now I get this shortened URL over here. Useful for when you're using services that restrict the number of characters you're going to be, you know, you're allowed to type. If you're limited to say 140 characters, text messages, or if it's up on a slide at a presentation and people need to type it in by hand. All useful things for reasons you would want to shorten a URI. So this is the product. The cool part is it does more than just shortening. What I can do is I can actually get analytics based on the following of those URIs. So here's the analytics page. Here's a URL that was shortened. The long URL is just google.com. The shortened URL is the FBS capital S. And you can see how many people have clicked through or used that shortened URL to go to the long URL over time. Right? There's the referrers, where that actually occurred. You get to know the countries, the browsers, the platforms, things like that. So nice, useful information. You can get those analytics over different time ranges, weeks, months, all time. So that's a useful service. But as a software developer, it's not a too useful service to you, right? You may want to add a shortening service to your product, right? That's where it comes in useful, right? So then we introduced the Google URL Shortener API. This is an API to do that same exact service on Google URL Shortener. So here is the link to the documentation. And here's a shortened link to the documentation. You saw what I did there. Before we go diving into that documentation, though, I want to take a little detour into REST. So all of the APIs that we've introduced are RESTful. Now, in short, you know, what does REST mean? It means we're using HTTP and we're using it in a nice way, right? We're using it, you know, we're using a lot of the capabilities of HTTP, and so REST. Let's do a brief introduction to that. Once we get that brief introduction down, that will help us understand kind of the documentation. It will give us a framework for understanding the documentation for all these APIs. So one of the common idioms in REST is this idea of a collection, right? It's a collection, it's a bag, it's a set, it's a grouping of similar things, right? And lots of things in the world fall into this idea of collections. Here, a collection, everything in that collection is called a resource, right? Resources have URIs. So there's a URI, they live out on the web, there's a URI for them. If I send an HTTP GET to that URI, I'll get back a representation of whatever that resource is. So one collection could be my Buzz activities, right? Each activity in my each activity in that activity stream has a URI. I do a get on it, and in this case, I get back JSON, JSON representation of what that is, which is nice, easy. I can manipulate that programmatically. Could be contacts in a contact list. It could be shortened URLs, right? Like that collection could be all the URLs I've ever shortened. But the important point is they have URIs. You call get on them, you get back a representation. Now, I could take that representation, JSON, modify it in some way, whatever's legal for the API, modify it, update it, change something about it, and call put. Call HTTP put with that JSON right back to that same exact URI. That updates it within the collection. Okay? So it's a very simple yin-yang thing there. I get it, modify it, put it. It's always back to that same URI. If I want to remove something from a collection, I posted something inappropriate, I call delete, and it removes it from my activity stream. Or I can post. I take that JSON representation of what a resource is, I post it to the collection, it adds it. Itself has a URI. I can call get on that, and that returns me a list of all the things that are in that collection. So this is really simple. Like I said, it's a bag. It's a group of stuff, and there's some rules for how to manipulate it. In this case, all those rules go by what is available in HTTP. So now we can start diving in to the Google URL Shortener API. And this is why I wanted to take that little detour into REST, because you can now see the Google URL Shortener is broken up into one collection, right? There's our thing. There's a URL collection. It's just a bag of collections. And here's those methods that we talked about. I can insert a long URL into that collection. When I insert the long URL, that creates its shortened equivalent. I can get, if I know a shortened URL, I can call HTTP get on it, and I can get the long URL of it. And finally, list, I can get a list of all my shortened URLs out of that collection. So obviously, this is a very small API, right? If you look at Buzz, there's going to be lots of collections in there. But this is why I like the Shortener API, because it's small, but it gets to the point that there's these collections, and this is how you manipulate it. So we can now go look at the documentation for the Google URL Shortener API. I can look at the docs. And I can go here and look at the reference guide. And you'll now see, let me blow this up so it's actually visible on the screen. Right? There's that, what I told you about before. There, it's a collection, insert, get, and delete. And finally, URL resource. This is going to be, what is that representation? What's that thing I'm sending across the wire that represents a shortened URL, a member of that collection? So in this case, it's a shortened URL. The long URL is obviously going to have to be in there. The status, when it was created, analytics, ID is actually going to be the shortened URL. And we'll actually see this, we'll play around with this a little more. So down here, it's going to tell you what all the different properties are on that object that goes back and forth. All right, so that documentation describes, right, what the representations are, what the URIs that you're going to be getting to and from, and the methods that get applied, and the description of that. So at this point, we could send you off into the woods, right? Take your favorite programming language, your HTTP library, and your JSON, your favorite JSON library, and go to town. And you could do that, right? But we have more help available to get you going and up to speed on that. So, but like I said, we have client libraries, and we'll go through the list of client libraries yourself. We'll go through the list of client libraries later. But if you're using a programming language that we aren't covering right now, you may have to get that HTTP client library and JSON library and start building a client library. And if you are, you might want to attend that building custom client library section I talked about at I/O. I believe that's on Wednesday. So let's go back. So, but we have help. One of the bits of help is APIs Explorer. APIs Explorer is built on top of that discovery document. So here, code.google.com/APIs/Explorer. This is a tool for helping you navigate around and learn about APIs. It's a web-based application. It has all the APIs that are built on this API infrastructure on it. And it allows you to actually make live requests and manipulate these APIs yourself. So you can look down this list. This is the list I showed you before. Buzz, custom search, diacritize, moderator, prediction, shopping, site verification. Looks like there's already a new one in there. OK, URL shortener. There's our URL shortener. V1 is the version. There's right now only one version of the URL shortener API. If there was another one, you'd have multiples to choose from. And here's those methods we talked about on that collection: get, insert, and list. So I can actually start playing with this URL API live. And now I'm going to have to actually shrink this down a bit so I can get in here. So on get, I have two parameters over here. I have the short URL, and I have the projection, right? Analytics clicks, analytics top strings, and full. So let's go back and look actually at the reference documentation for that so we can line these two things up. So I have URL get, all right, URL get method. This I should be able to expand. Let me get back to here. All right, can you see that? OK. So method requires two query parameters, your API key. We're not going to talk about that right now. It also understands the optional query parameter, the projection. And so remember I pointed you to that resource that had all that information about what that URI was, the shortened URI. You can actually get subsets of that information. You may not need it all. So there's some abilities to get shortened bits of it. So let's go back to APIs Explorer. So in order to do this, the first thing I needed is the short URL. So http://goo.gl/fbs. That was our shortened URL that we were looking at earlier. And I'm just going to execute this, because that's my only required field. And I execute it. And so now you see what happened. It did a get on HTTPS Google APIs URL shortener v1 URL, passed in the short URL. And what does it do? It gives me back JSON. It tells me what kind it is. Obviously, it's a URL shortener resource. But there's the short URL, and there's the long version. Obviously, shortening google.com is not a terribly good use of the service, but you get the idea. And the status is OK. Now, I can go back up and say what projection I want. Do I want the clicks? Do I want the top strings? Or do I want full? I'm going to get full. I rerun that same exact query. This is running live. It's going through my browser, but it's still using that same API. And now I get to look at what the response would be if I wanted a full projection. So I've got my status, when I created it, and then the analytics for all time. How many times was that expanded? The counts. All of that information that you saw in that web interface that was available in the product is available here through this search, through this API. So all the parts of the API. So this is an important part of learning to, and using these APIs. First, go check out the documentation. Second, play around with it in the APIs Explorer and make sure it can do what you want it to do. And then, as we'll get to in a bit, actually start, picking a client library and manipulating it that way. So there's get. Here's insert. I want to add a request. So insert doesn't take any parameters, right? But I have to give it a JSON body to send over. So I'm going to go back over here and look at the insert. I'm going to post, and it's going to give me an example of what the JSON should look like that I'm going to be posting to there. So I'll copy that. And what's my long URL? http://google.com/io. So there's my body. I execute that. And now that's what happened, right? So I posted to that URI. I posted this content. and it sends me back, here's my URL that I shortened for you. So there's the long URL, and there's the shortened version of it. So I can manipulate all these APIs. Finally, last step, list. So I can get a list, and this doesn't have any required parameters. I can get a list of all the APIs that I've created, shortened URLs that I've created. All right, this failed. I wanted it to. So this method requires you to be authenticated. So if we go back and look at this reference up at the top, you'll notice this column, access authenticated, over here. This is user data, right? All the other stuff is kind of public information, right? There's a shortened URL, it's been shortened, there's a short version and a long version. This, though, list is my shortened URLs, the ones that I've created. So that being user-specific data, I'm going to have to log in to get that. Now, that is done using OAuth 2. Here on the API, I'm going to say switch to private access on the API's Explorer. And it says I want to manipulate this application, which is API's Explorer, is requesting permission to manage my short URLs. Yes?
Does that mean that all the analytics are public too?
Yes, on Google URL Shortener. So yeah, you saw me pull up those analytics. That the FSSFB that goes to google.com, I didn't create that one. So, and we'll go through and see that it isn't there. So yes, all the analytics are there, but you can't tie it to the person who actually created that short URL. So this flow here is an OAuth flow, right? And it's very important that you'll notice what isn't happening. What isn't happening is the API's Explorer is not asking me for my name and password, right? It's a very important thing that we're trying to get away from. You don't want to get your users into the habit of entering their name and password and things. So one of the things we're stressing is OAuth 2 in this case for all these APIs. OAuth is a system that allows you to have a person give permission for an app, either a desktop app, mobile app, or a web app, access to an API without them having to type their name and password into that application. And that's what's happening here. The API's Explorer is asking me for permission to say that it can manipulate my shortened URLs. So we're going to go into this a little bit more, but there are other talks if you're interested in OAuth 2. I'll get to those on the slides. There are other talks that go into more detail on OAuth 2. So I'm going to say yes. I'm going to give you access. I'll now rerun that request. Now that API's Explorer is authorized, and now you can see these shortened links, right? And there's the one. There's the one yep, that's the one I just created right now, right? There's the shortened version, the long version. It's OK, and that's when I created it. So that is API's Explorer. So there was this idea, though, that I had to log in. All right, that's API's Explorer. API's console. So OAuth. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail into OAuth, but there's a little bits you need to know. So that leads us now into the next tool that we have, which is API's console. Here's also, like I said, I'm going to go into a little bit of OAuth. If you want to learn more about OAuth right now, there's the, unfortunately, unshortened link to the OAuth 2 documentation. There's also two other talks coming up at I/O. There's the Life of a Google API Developer, and there's Client Login Fail. Okay, Client Login Fail. Client Log is actually a login system that requires end users to put in their user's name and password. As you can see, we're trying to lead you away from that. So those are two other talks you might want to check out. But the API's console. So you've looked at the documentation. You see an API that's going to work for you. You've played around with it in the API's Explorer. It does what you want it to do. You've got it working. You're pretty happy. OK, now you're going to start building an application. For you to build an application, first stop is going to be the API's console. This is where we're going to set up a correspondence between you, the person, and the application you're building. So I'm going to come into, that's APIs/console. I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to create a new project. So this is going to be my BootCamp project. BootCamp sample. I'll create that project. And now you'll see here, I have the list of all the APIs that are available to me to use in that application. And right now, they're all off. Right? So if I'm going to build a URL shortener one, I'm going to have to turn that on. Now, I may or may not have to read the terms of service. It actually didn't pop up in this case because I'd actually already read it. But as you turn on these APIs, you'll probably have to read terms of service and agree to them that, yes, I'm building an app. I know what the terms of service are for that API. And I'm going to turn that on. You will see that I have a courtesy limit of 1 million queries per day. Okay? I think for my sample, I'm all set. I don't think I'll run out of that. You will also see, though, that for some APIs, like prediction, there's pricing. The courtesy limit is 100 queries a day. You might very well run out of that. Pricing is you can buy more quota for that. And so for each one of those, there is going to be prices associated with those.
Where are the geo APIs?
OK, so this is the, you'll notice, like I said, Google has about 100 APIs or so. This is not 100. It's a long list, but it's not. The other APIs are the Google Data APIs, and they currently do not show up in here. So we're working on getting APIs moving over onto the new console and onto the new API infrastructure. So.
Are the courtesy limits, you have an apps account with courtesy is different?
I am scanning the back row looking for a product manager. And are they different for apps? I don't believe they're different for apps. OK, the question was, are the courtesy limits different if you're using this against an apps, Google Apps domain? OK, and the answer is I believe the limits are the same. Good question. I hadn't thought about that. OK, so I'm going to come in and I'm going to create a console here, create an application. I turn on just the APIs I want. Right? That's because I'm going to then go down and create. I could go here. I could go, woo, I'm going to go wild, and I'm going to turn on all the APIs for this, right? Besides accepting a lot of terms of service, there's no real downside to that. You don't want to do that, though, because you're going to be setting up OAuth credentials for your application. And if you somehow lose those credentials are then good for every API you've turned on in here, right? So you want to actually pick as narrow a set as possible, just for the sake of safety. So if I have billing that I need to turn on, say for the prediction API, you would come down here, use your Google checkout, turn on billing. Then we get down to API access. So in order to use OAuth from within your application, you're going to need to create OAuth client IDs for that. So I come in here, and I'm going to say, this is my BootCamp sample application. Remember when I authorized the APIs Explorer? Up at the top, it said Google APIs Explorer wants access to whatever you're getting access to. That's where this comes in. All right? Your users are going to get a screen like that. It's going to go, my app, blah, blah, blah. This is where you get to say what that shows up there. You can also actually put a product logo up there, so people can be assured, yes, I'm really authorizing access to what I think I'm authorizing access to. Next step in creating those OAuth credentials are creating the application type. Either it's a web application or it's an installed application. In this case, we'll just go with installed application. There's going to be some differences. Like I said, that'll be covered in the OAuth 2 talks later. But I'll create my client ID. The only thing you really need to know about this is that I've got a client ID and a client secret. And those need to be cut and paste and put over into your application using the OAuth 2 client libraries for what you're working with. That says then when the person goes to authorize into that application, it'll now pop up on the screen. They don't have to enter a name or password. And it says this application, which is now tied to you because you logged into this console, this application wants access to your data. So you're setting up that trust there. So if, though, you have an API, say you were just building an app that unshortened URLs. Remember, that didn't require authentication, right? That did not require authenticated access. It wasn't accessing user data. If that's the case, then you don't need to use OAuth, but you still do need to use the API key. And all the client libraries have this as available. And you saw that actually in the documentation, right? So when I go back to this reference documentation, you'll see this key here as this parameter. That's what this is. This is the simple API access. So you can't use this to access protected user data. But if you're accessing an API that doesn't need it, like the URL shortener get, then you can just use this. The user then won't be thrown through that OAuth 2 flow. It'll just work. The nice part about this, though, is you then get lots of nice statistics. Whether you use OAuth 2 or the API access, your use of that API is tied to you, and we can now keep track of statistics. So you can get to know, figure out how much your API is actually used. So that's the API access. That gives me my credentials that I'm going to put into my application. And finally, team. Once you've created this project, you can start adding other people into this. So it's tied to more than one person. So that's the developer console. Like I said, if you're interested in OAuth 2 and how these pieces tie together, there is 2 more talks coming up at I/O that'll go into this in much more detail. Finally, libraries. OK, like I said, we weren't going to throw you off into the woods with just HTTP and JSON. So we have client libraries available. We have Python and Java. Those libraries are in beta. Beta for Google means that they are obviously actively developed, but at this point, we're down to bug fixing and adding new features. We don't expect major changes to the interfaces for these APIs. We really want you to start building on top of these libraries. Alpha means actively under construction. We'd like you to use them, but they're actively under construction. Stuff will break. Stuff will break in backward incompatible. We're experimenting. We're iterating on these systems, and they're under development. So for Alpha, we have PHP, Ruby, and .NET libraries. And like I said, for the beta versions, we have Python and Java. Above and beyond those client libraries, we have specific documentation. So actually, let me just follow through and look at the Python client library. So here's the documentation for it. You go to there, you'll be landed on it. They're obviously hosted on code.google.com. You've got documentation for it. Each one of these client libraries will have a getting started guide. This will walk you through what does the API look like, how is it used, how do you install it, plenty of documentation there. So you can see here on the side the different platforms it works on, lots of OAuth 2 documentation, advanced information on debugging, optimizing, thread safety, things like that. So, and these are open source projects. You find a bug, you can just report it in the issue tracker. That would be great. If you find a bug and know how to fix it, you can contribute a patch. That would be even better. But they're all open source, so you can see how they work. Download it, fiddle with it, get it to work for you. So that's the Python client library. Like I said, all of the client libraries are going to have this same structure, developer's guide, et cetera. Also associated with this is going to be more documentation. So reference documentation is basically the core of the library for the Python library. Now, unless you program in Python, this looks ugly. If you program in Python, it looks ugly too, but you understand it. Okay, so this is the standard way of documenting Python client libraries. The Java client library, no surprise, it has JavaDoc. But not only that, there is documentation for the individual APIs. So this is going to be what those API surfaces look like in Python for a particular API. So, for example, URL shortener. Remember we said it was a collection, right? There was a collection. There's that URL collection. And here's those three methods associated with that: get, insert, and list. And you can see how this becomes, if you're reading the documentation. If I wanted to do a get on the URL shortener, my arguments are the projection, which is a string, and it has these values. Remember when I did it in the APIs Explorer, I used full. That got me my full analytics. And then I also have to pass in as a parameter the short URL. Insert, there's the body I have to insert. We did that. And then list. And then I could also, the list actually took a projection, which we didn't put in either. So this URI, remember we started back with, there was that RESTful interface. It was this idea of collections. That whole collection idiom boils down into the API itself. And now, as you can see, it's the same exact surface in the generated Python client library. We covered PyDoc. We covered PyDoc per API. Obviously, like I said, there's JavaDoc for the Java client library. Should be familiar to you if you are a Java programmer. One of the other tools is Google plugin for Eclipse. So this is a plugin that just recently added APIs support into it. So it's a plugin for Eclipse, if Eclipse is your editor. And this will allow you easier access into those APIs. And I'm actually going to demo this in just a second. Apparently, I'm going to demo it right now. OK. So let's fire up Eclipse. So here's where I defy all common sense and do a live demo. And a live demo in Eclipse, nonetheless. Where am I? OK. So, all right. So Google plugin for Eclipse is a plugin originally launched with this idea that you can create. Oh, that is not the one I wanted. It's not the Eclipse I was looking for. So, all right. While we're waiting for Eclipse to launch, let's do Python. OK. So we said this is what Python is good for filling in the time. So we went and we want to do the URL shortener, right? And this is the documentation for the URL shortener. We're going to presume Python. So we will come in here, and in Python, I want to import. Is that big enough so everybody can see? Let's see if I can up that even more. Edit, preferences, fonts and colors. Sorry about this. Should have been bigger to begin with. All right, can you read that? API client.discovery. No, that's from import build. OK, so I want to create a service interface, build. Now, which API do I want to interact with? It's URL shortener. The name and the version need to be passed in. It's URL shortener and v1, URL shortener and v1. That gives me that service. Now, if I go and look in here, look at the surface, one collection, that's URL. So service.url. And what are the methods that are available on that collection? Get, insert, and list. So I'm going to do get. So .get. And what do I pass in? Short URL is required. That's the only thing I need. So short URL equals http://goo.gl/fbss. Sure. .execute. execute. Need a little more caffeine. All right, and I will now save this. File, save as, save it to my desktop as shorten2.py. I'm now going to go to my desktop. There is shorten2.py. No sleight of hand, I really just did type that. Python, shorten2.py, I run it, and there it is. It's shortened that URI. You can see here, status of OK, my shortening worked. There's my ID of the shortened one that I had, and the long URL that I just unwrapped that from. So it's a very simple service. So if we are now lucky, Eclipse has finished loading. I'm going to close that project. So I'm going to come in here and create a new web application project. So this is what Google Plugin for Eclipse initially launched with. It's got support for Google Web Toolkit and Google App Engine. So it's for making Java applications with those. To keep things simple, I am going to turn off Google Web Toolkit for this example, but I'm going to create an App Engine example. My project name is sample3 com.google.sample3. So this goes through, blasts out all the code I need in Java. So here's my source, Google sample3. There's my code. It just, creates my little servlet, which will run on App Engine, right? And it runs text plain. It says hello world. So if I'll run that. Now, obviously, this isn't an App Engine talk, but we'll see in a second where this is going. Localhost 8888. There's my sample3 servlet, and it says hello world. In very tiny letters. Let's zoom that in. That says hello world. Okay. Right. So that's good, but I said we had help for APIs. Import, and so add Google API. And this structure should look fairly simple to you. Code search, calendar, books, Buzz, Moderator, spreadsheets, URL shortener. There's our API. So this will add in support for the URL shortener API in Java into this project. So I am going to stop running because I made that mistake before. You will now notice over here on the left-hand side, Google URL shortener. Here is the base API client library, which is that. And then there is this library that's been added in, which has very specific code to the URL shortener API. Let me expand that out there a little bit. OK, there's an HTTP client class. That's good. We're making requests. There's a URL shortener class. That's good. We're using URL shortener. And there's the model classes down here. So now we can start using that API and all of the goodness of Eclipse. So I want to import URL shortener. That's the correct one. Equals new URL shortener. What are the parameters I'm missing? My string, my transport, and my factory. So this is going to be my BootCamp sample. I need a new net HTTP transport and a new Jackson factory. Those are for HTTP and JSON. All right, we're currently very happy. Let's expand this out so we can actually see the whole code. So now we need to use this service layer. So I'm going to say s dot, hey, there's URL, right? Remember, same idiom. There's the collection. What do I want in that collection? I want to do a get. What do I want to get? Well, that's the shortened URL, right? http://goo.gl/fbs capital S. I now dream about that URL. And then I call, oops, dot. Execute on that. That should give me back a URL. And that URL I need to import from the model. Yay. And then so instead of here, down here, I'm going to print out URL dot long URL. So same thing we've been doing the whole time. Right? So again, common idioms. We've got this API. It's a collection we call get, but you notice now I've got all the nice pieces of autocomplete. I'm now going to run my project again. And once we're running, blam, there's our long URL. So, cool. So, like I said at the beginning of the talk, here's that Python code that we just did. Don't expect you to understand every bit of it. But I hope by now, by the end of the talk, you now know where to go to get the information. All right? We know that this is the Python client library. I gave you the link to that, Google API Python client. We know it's the URL Shortener API. We know where to go for the docs for that. If we need a developer key, we know where to go for that. That's the APIs console. We want to know what the actual calls are per an API. That's API Python client doc. That's the API specific documentation for Python. And finally, if I want to exercise and play around with this, that's the APIs Explorer. So we covered a lot. There's a lot of APIs out there. We're introducing more all the time. You can see all the other APIs. So like I said, like the question came up before, these are the APIs that we're talking about right now that are built on top of that new infrastructure. We still have lots of other APIs on the older infrastructure, the Google Data APIs. You want to see all the APIs we have available, code.google.com/more. If you like this section and wanted to get a little more hands-on with it, if you wanted to, go through the APIs Explorer hands-on, get some hands-on with some Python code, we have a lab this afternoon, 1:45 to 3:45 in Robertson 2, hands-on with the Google APIs lab. Like I said before, we're just going to basically go through this presentation, but in a lot more detail, hands-on at every step, get into some code at the end. And finally, between now and the hands-on in the lab, and actually for the rest of the day, the folks from the APIs team are going to be available in office hours. So here, this link should bring you to your prerequisites. If you were interested in the lab, you should have already gotten an email that said, here's the prereqs to install. If you don't have those installed or you need help installing those, come to office hours. We'll give you a hand. Or if you just have questions on APIs, again, come to office hours. And that's it. Thanks. We've got about 10 minutes for questions.
I have a question. The Java client libraries, are they optimized for Android by any chance?
So the question was, are there Java client libraries optimized for Android? Yes, the Java client libraries use a tool which escapes me now, but that restricts them down so that they do run on Android.
So the code will be essentially the same?
Yes. Yes.
These are RESTful web services, and it looks like they're mostly returning JSON. Do any of them, the public ones at least, have an ability to give a callback parameter to do like JSON-P?
So the question was, can we do callbacks, JSON-P callbacks for these APIs? And the answer is yes, they do accept that callback parameter. So yes. Yeah, the post is to add a new one, and there's a put to update. So you actually don't see that in the URL Shortener API. but you can look through some of the other APIs. For example, the Buzz has a put to update an activity, for example.
So that's because the URL shortener doesn't have the ability to update.
Right. Yes.
Is there like data filtering capability so the data return just one certain data rather than the entire sets when I try to access to get an object?
Okay, so the question was, can I restrict what comes back through that? Yeah, what we saw in the URL shortener, there's this idea of a projection to restrict the set of the data that comes back per entry. Lots of other APIs also support query parameters. So instead of getting everything that's in the collection, you can get just things that match that query. There's also an idea of pagination. So you can set max results, only return me 25. And then there's a way to paginate and say, get the next page of results. So is that okay? All right, any other questions? All right, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you in office hours and at the lab.